Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming to the inaugural lecture of this year's Gender Research Institute at Dartmouth, or GRID, speaker series. I'm Susan Bryson, chair of the philosophy department and a fellow in this year's GRID seminar, and I'm truly honored and delighted to be able to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Denis Goldberg. I have to begin by thanking the director of GRID, Professor Annabelle Martin. She had the dream of bringing scholars and activists together at Dartmouth in a remarkable institute dedicated to the theory and practice of social justice. Her vision, hard work, and persistence turned that dream into a reality, and she launched GRID last spring with an extremely successful seminar and lecture series on seeds of change, gender scholarship, and social justice, and organized another exciting seminar and lecture series for this spring on times of crisis. I'd also like to thank the newly hired GRID administrator, Nancy O'Brien, who hit the ground running and somehow managed to keep up with Annabelle, who leaves the rest of us in the dust. And finally, I want to thank and acknowledge the remarkable alumni activists who just spoke to us this afternoon. And thank all the Dartmouth students and alums who are dedicating themselves in so many ways to making the world a more just and less violent place. No one is better qualified to give the inaugural lecture in this year's GRID seminar on times of crisis than today's speaker, Denis Goldberg. He has devoted his entire life to fighting for justice. He lived through and fought to end the system of racial apartheid in South Africa. He was prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice of dying for freedom, for the freedom of others. He did pay the price of being sentenced to life imprisonment and served 22 years in prison. This year is, in fact, the 50th anniversary of the Rivonia trial at which Mr. Goldberg was sentenced to life imprisonment. Until 4 months ago, there were 4 survivors of those given life sentences at Rivonia: Nelson Mandela, Ahmed Kathrada, Andrew Mngeni, and Denis Goldberg. Now, with Nelson Mandela's passing last December, there are 3. Denis Goldberg was born in Cape Town in 1933, a first-generation South African to English parents. Raised, as he says, with all the privileges of a white South African, he went to university and became an engineer, but he wanted to build things for people, not for white people. So he joined the Modern Youth Society in South Africa in 1953 and became a member of the Congress of Democrats in the African National Congress, or ANC, in 1954. In 1961, he joined the military wing of the ANC, and in May 1963, he advanced to the National High Command. In July of '63, Denis was arrested at Liliesleaf Farm and detained for 90 days. In October of that year, he was charged in the historic Rivonia trial, along with Nelson Mandela and 8 others, of, among other things, conspiracy to overthrow the state. This was an entirely accurate description of their goal, as they were revolutionaries plotting to overthrow the apartheid regime. Indeed, the New York Times called the Rivonia trialists the George Washingtons and James Madisons of South Africa. The crime of conspiracy under this regime was punishable by death. On the day of sentencing in 1964, the men on trial expected to be hanged, as so many other freedom fighters had been and would continue to be. So when they heard that they were given life sentences, in Denis's case, as in Nelson Mandela's, 4 life sentences, they were so relieved they burst out laughing. There was a great deal of commotion in the court, and Denis's mother, who hadn't heard what the judge had said, called out, "Denis, what is it?" And he answered, "Life. Life is wonderful." Denis's life has been and continues to be truly extraordinary. I'm not going to even attempt to give a summary of all of his remarkable accomplishments and accolades, but I will urge you to read his memoir, The Mission, A Life for Freedom in South Africa. Those of us who were in the GRID seminar this term have read it and have had very fruitful discussions of it. I'll just say that after living in exile in England for many years, serving as an international spokesperson for the ANC, he moved back to Cape Town. In 1995, a year after Nelson Mandela was sworn in as president of South Africa, Denis founded Community Heart, an acronym standing for Health, Education, and Reconstruction Training. currently supports, this organization supports the Kronendahl Music Academy, Rape Crisis, Cape Town, and Ububele, a psychotherapy resource center in Johannesburg. I had the privilege of meeting Denis in Lagos last December. It was the night Nelson Mandela passed away. And having had the very humbling experience of spending the subsequent week with Denis giving talks in Nigeria, I have to tell you that in addition to being an astonishingly accomplished and inspiring world historical figure, he is a warm, witty, and utterly delightful man. Nelson Mandela said, "A good head..."
I accept. if you'll forgive me.
Okay, even though this is going to be filmed, I can't resist saying this, which my husband hasn't heard, but we did travel around by airplane, and I was escorting Denis, and he, since he's awaiting hip replacement, was walking with crutches, and everyone who addressed me would address me as Mrs. Goldberg.
I was so embarrassed.
I was flattered, on the other hand. Nelson Mandela said, "A good heart and a good head are always a formidable combination." Now add extraordinary courage, determination, persistence, and for one who lived through all the times of crisis, Denis has lived through astonishing joie de vivre. You have our next speaker, whose talk this afternoon is entitled Actions, Passions, Crises. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Denis Goldberg.
Thanks, Susan, for that. And thanks to Grid and Dartmouth for inviting me. Actually, it's the second time I've been here. And each time there seems to be some kind of crisis between students and management. Last time was before the end of apartheid, and students had built a shanty town on the campus, and management was really angry. And the students refused to take it down until they had discussed the issue of divestment. University funds invested in apartheid South Africa. I was invited to be a keynote speaker at a weekend seminar, and Ron Dellums, Democrat congressman from Oakland who pushed through the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act through Congress with bipartisan support, was a keynote speaker on the other night of the weekend. It was really an astonishing event, and I remember having a working breakfast with the trustees of the university funds, the college funds, and they thought I'd give them a real doing over apartheid, a moral approach. And I said to them quite quietly, if I were the students, I would sue them for dereliction of their fiduciary duty, because they were maintaining investments in South Africa, which because of its political policies, all shares had lost a third of their value. Now, the duty of the trustees is to look after the university's funds, not to uphold apartheid. We would have taken them to court and won, because there had been a similar case in Texas, not about apartheid, but of trustees having a different agenda from their fiduciary duty. That rather shook them a little bit, that this red from South Africa would give them a lecture in business ethics. But I then gave them hell about apartheid. Let me start with my formal talk. The title of my talk is taken from the remark of the renowned judge Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. When we were young, our hearts were touched with fire, and as life is action and passion, it is required of one, he said, required of a man. I'm translating it because I'm gender sensitive. It is required of one that one should share the passion and action of one's time, at the peril of being judged not to have lived. I think I can fairly say that I've lived a life of passion and action, and faced several crises, some private, some public, and some public-private. I've loved and been loved and buried 2 wives who died after long illnesses. I have buried my daughter who died at the age 46 from cancer. All of this in the private sphere of my life, which included being unable to attend the funerals of my mother and then my father, because I was in prison for 22 years. I also created crises in the lives of my wife and 2 children, because I consciously placed myself in harm's way, because I believe that what is important in being human is to act with passion, with determination, to overcome what is morally unacceptable in our society. Spouses and children bear the brunt of such a life. One might say that they pay the price for the freedom we have won. I tell you, I have to disagree with the previous speaker who said that all that is in life is joy of being happy. We live in a society. We have responsibility for each other. We are not islands unto ourselves, as various poets have said. It's the opposite for Africans, black Africans, as against black Americans. The philosophy is called Ubuntu, and translated into English it says, I am who I am only through others. It's a different philosophy. Happiness comes from service to others. Happiness comes from social courage. I see bullying, I must stop it. I see rape, I must intervene. I see injustice, I must act. That's how revolutions are made. That's how things are put right. Facing the gallows in the famous Rivonia trial was more than trying, and all the possible wordplay on trying adds to the depth of the passion, and thus of that crisis in my life. How to deal with the thought of execution at age 31 for demanding justice for all the people of my country. That was both public and private. Public because the actions of my comrades and I were in the public sphere, of the passionate belief in equal rights for all, and the right to take action by taking up arms to overthrow a tyrannical, unjust regime. I'm sure you all remember the quotation. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. Who said it? Thomas Jefferson, in defense of those early Americans of the New England states who opposed the British domination of the American colonies through a wealthy merchant class. He was warning us not to automatically accept the allegedly moral dictates of those in power who assert the right to autocratically decide how we should live our lives. Perhaps those modern-day Americans and people of other nationalities who often support tyrants in what they perceive to be their national interest should see they have not understood Jefferson's warning, thereby involving all the world, all of us the world over, in one crisis after another. I am invited here by GRID, and so I'll turn to the issue of gender, perhaps from a masculine point of view, but having had lots of time to read in prison, and so to try to shape my thinking. There are deep crises affecting women in my country, and I shall describe some of the problems. During my time in prison, there was time, endless time, to read and reflect. Issues of feminism and gender equality became a topic of interest, and I think I have greater understanding than previously. Translating that understanding into interpersonal practice is less certain than knowing when one's got it wrong. Some of the earliest writing on this matter in the 18th century was by English women of the landed gentry. Women were legally minors without legal competence, yet they were required to run the family estates, which included their own wealth, which they brought into the family, which then became that of their husbands. Their husbands stereotypically rode to hounds and debauched themselves, bringing syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases into their families. Towards the end of the 19th century, a growing literature on women's rights appeared. In South Africa, Olive Schreiner's great novel, Story of an African Farm, for example. Her work, Women and Labour, is said to be the best expression of her concerns with socialism and gender equality. She had a vision of a non-racist, non-sexist South Africa. She opposed British imperialism during the Boer War and the First World War. During the last years of her life, she died in 1920, she was increasingly isolated from white society. However, she continued to be involved in politics and was determined to make her mark on a new constitution, especially through her work, Closer Union, in which she argued for more rights, not only for blacks, but also for women. She also joined the newly founded Cape branch of the Women's Enfranchisement League in 1907. She'd been in London, and she'd been part of the enfranchisement right, led by upper middle class women in Britain as well, demanding the right to vote, the name that the Pankhursts and so on, I'm sure are familiar to you. She became vice president of this organization, but withdrew her support when other branches wished to exclude black women from the vote. I've quoted this from Wikipedia, so you can look it up and read it more fully. It's an easy reference instead of having to go to the complex literature. I don't want to strain your brains. I also read about the communist Rosa Luxemburg in Germany and many Bolshevik women in Russia who claimed their equality. There were also many women in the Social Democratic Party in Germany who actively promoted women's rights. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex provided an existential approach to the status of women, and Juliet Mitchell in Britain in the 1970s began to provide a Marxist approach to the oppression of women, raising issues of social class and bias against women. These issues had come to the fore during World War I, when women worked in munitions factories, while hundreds and thousands of men were fighting and dying in battle. But after the war was over, the women were sent home again, and again it was educated upper middle class women who took up the issues of the rights of women in society. The same happened during World War II. Think of a movie, you're old enough, Rosie the Riveter, you remember? But this time when the war was over, there was an economic boom during the Korean War, and industrialists found that they could employ women at lower rates of pay than men in the factories, and, as we know, low wages make fat profits. Interestingly, male workers and their trade unions sided with employers against women workers. But now the die was cast, and probably for the first time, working-class women in the industrialized countries began demanding equal pay for equal work and their rights. Today, in the advanced countries, we have paid maternity leave, for example, and other enforceable rights, and we shouldn't underestimate the gains that have been made. But we also heard from Danielle earlier how far removed that is from countries in Africa, including one of the richest, South Africa, for African women. I was also able to read Ms., the flagship of US gender publications in the latter years of the 20th century, and also lesser-known South African magazines. We said in apartheid times that the oppression of the majority of women in South Africa was threefold. They were oppressed as women, as workers, and as black women, and especially as black working women. During the struggles against apartheid, O.R. Tambo, the leader of the ANC during 30 years of exile to the dawn of freedom, would say that the freedom of women is a task for women and men together. These issues have been formally resolved in South Africa's post-apartheid constitution of 1996, which guarantees equal rights to all adults. Today, implementing, of course, is more difficult, but the guarantees are there and we work towards it. Today, the ANC is the ruling party in the national government, and in 8 of the 9 provinces, ensures equal representation of women and men in elected assemblies by having men and women candidates listed alternatively. And since the election is based on proportional representation by list vote, this automatically achieves the goal of equal representation of that party's members in parliament and provincial legislatures. They use other mechanisms in municipal elections where there are ward elections and so on. There is conflict, however, with traditional leaders, reed chiefs, tribal chiefs, who demand their allegedly traditional rights under African custom. These customs have often been distorted under colonial and apartheid rule. Chiefs were made part of the state administration and could be installed and dismissed by the white settler, the white colonial or apartheid government, depending on which stage of our history we are considering. The traditional, fundamentally democratic processes of customary law were undermined by the autocratic rule of native commissioners and other officials. There is currently a bill before our Parliament intended to regulate the powers of the traditional leaders. They are paid by the government, by the way. Some of its provisions are in direct conflict with our Constitution. Essentially, women are always minors in customary law and unable to represent themselves or to speak at tribal courts and other meetings. The bill has been stalled for years because of this and other conflicts. In practice, extreme poverty hits women harder because they are left to bring up children on their own, men frequently making babies, then leaving for newer pastures. This happens in all societies, which is why there are laws about child support by absent parents, mainly fathers who are absent. Laws are one thing, enforcement is another, as you know from the United States as well as Great Britain and other countries. Today, rape and sexual abuse and violence is a serious problem in South Africa that is said to be an act stemming from powerlessness rather than erotic sexual behavior. One might also suggest disruption of families and networks in a period of transition as an important factor in this phenomenon. An example of this occurred during the recent collapse of Yugoslavia during a period of nationalistic excess. Even though people of different religions had intermarried for over 2 generations, rape was a weapon in the assertion of national independence. Why do men see their organs as weapons? After our liberation in 1994, British friends and I set up community heart, health, education and reconstruction training as a registered charity in Britain. One of our first successful funding efforts was for Rape Crisis Cape Town. To date, we have sourced mainly from the UK and Germany at least $1.6 million. Then they had one half-time person. Now they have 3 officers and a large staff with many volunteers drawn from all the communities. And there are numerous such organizations in other parts of the country. According to the most recent Human Sciences Research Council's report, let me explain. In our Constitution, we have what are called Chapter 9 institutions designed to guarantee the safety of our democracy. The Human Sciences Research Council is one of them. The Public Protector is another. There are various other organizations designed to enable people to focus on issues affecting particular groups in society. The Human Sciences Research Council's report on HIV and AIDS says that more women are infected than men. The rates of infection appear to be falling, but the number of people living with HIV and AIDS is increasing because of the extensive treatment program. 2 million people receive ARV treatment. Thus, more people survive and live with the disease. The age group, I think around about 25 to 35, has infection rates of over 30%. There's also a tendency for a new generation of young people to practice unsafe sex by not using condoms and having multiple partners. Because the treatment program is being rolled out, they feel it's safe, that they can be treated afterwards if they infect each other. The Department of Health is seeking ways to deal with the ever-changing situation. There is a Ministry of Women and Children which works to advance in practice the rights of women. The payment of a children's allowance by government to those in need is important. Grants to children up to 18 years of age and senior citizens literally means the difference between starvation and survival. In addition, women having some income can pay childminders while they go out to find paid employment, often extremely menial. We have a long way to go in overcoming the disadvantages women suffer or overcome. It is both a question of material conditions and mindset. And latterly, there's been a most brutal occurrence of men raping, gang raping lesbian women and calling it curative rape. We will show you what you're missing. Where brutality can show people what they're missing, I don't understand. Women of all classes, education and race have been disadvantaged. Our Employment Equity Act requires that women be represented equally in all places of work, and demographically for racial groups as well, of course, be represented equally in all places of work above a minimum size. For this purpose, white women, who historically came from the most advantaged groups, are also included in the provisions of this Act because they were and still are disadvantaged because they're women. For example, under apartheid, there was only one woman judge in our legal system. She was white, an Afrikaans speaker, thus of the ruling group. She has said that she was more or less ignored by male judges, and only after the end of apartheid have more women of all races been appointed to the bench. Presently, about 30% of judges are women. There are also judicial officers or magistrates, many of whom are women. I'm not going to read the statistics to you. Thus, progress has been made, but more has to be done, and men in such positions have to learn to accept women as equals on the bench and the legal profession as a whole, and in every other profession and every other walk of life. Let me turn to the broader issues of a journey from apartheid racism by law, through the years of struggle and imprisonment, freedom, and 20 years into a democratic system that commenced in 1994. I mentioned HIV and AIDS. That's a real crisis for us with the infection rates that we have. But the biggest antiretroviral program of any country is being rolled out in our country and will continue to be rolled out. The research that's being done is also of tremendous importance. It used to take weeks for a test to be undertaken. It now takes 20 minutes with a little test strip like you do for diabetes. You can see marks on it, and if the person is positive, hey presto, you know. Tuberculosis and the strains of tuberculosis that are associated with HIV and AIDS have also become a critical issue in a health system that served whites with absolutely the best of all possible care under apartheid. For example, for whites, on average, there was one medical doctor, general practitioner, for 400 people, plus top-notch hospitals, government hospitals, free at the point of service, plus specialists of among the best in the world. For Africans, according to World Health Organization, there was, in various parts of the country, one doctor for 80,000 people, or one for 120,000. In Soweto, the black township next to Johannesburg, it was much better, one doctor for 3,000 people. Imagine getting ill and trying to see a doctor. You just don't get an appointment. Not easily anyway. But there was another matter. The gold mines in particular, but mining in general in South Africa, was exempted by law, a special law, from having liability for occupational health diseases. So miners' phthisis, which killed workers, could not be compensated for. Miners would be sent home to the countryside where they'd come from. They were not allowed to bring their families with them to work on the mines. Why? Well, the mines, in a formal statement in a judicial inquiry into mine wages in 1946, said, well, you see, the family needs so much money to survive and bring up children who will be the next generation of workers. We provide a barracks for the workers, a concrete bed and a little place to keep their tin box of possessions. We provide them 3 meals a day, and that costs us so much per worker. And we then need to pay them enough to send home to their wives to keep them alive. But you see, the women grow a few bags of maize, corn you would call it, and so we can deduct that from the amount of money needed. Serious calculation, technically called the labor theory, cost of labor, of reproducing the next generation of workers. And here was a great big capitalist group, the Chamber of Mines, following a Marxist analysis of what it cost to train workers and keep them alive. Such a contradiction in my country. And the judges concerned accepted all this argument. And so it continued that white workers were paid roughly 18 times as much as a black worker on the mines. That's how apartheid was maintained, and white workers became part of the control system, therefore had an interest in maintaining apartheid against all other workers. But miners' TISIS, TB, and so on, meant that workers went home to die with no compensation. And last year, I think it was, our new constitutional court struck this down as being unconstitutional, against the guarantees of the Constitution of equal rights for all. And so the mining companies are facing huge compensation claims. But I have to tell you, I'm not optimistic about how much the workers are going to get, those who suffered these diseases. Because some years ago, a group of miners who suffer from asbestosis sued the mining company, which is based in London now, for their diseases that killed so many people and left so many disabled. And the court ruled in favor of the workers. And the mining company has to pay out millions. Only they declared themselves bankrupt and said, do what you will, we're not paying you. And the same thing, I think, is going to happen with the gold mines. The gold mines, many of them have moved out of the country. They've taken their cash reserves. They're based on the London Stock Exchange or elsewhere, etc. And they'll find a way of not paying compensation. But it's taken 20 years of our freedom to undo 100 years of gross oppression and denial of human rights and dignity for the sake of profit. And that's what apartheid was about. Apartheid was a system of cheap labor, because as I said before, cheap labor makes fat profits. I'm not going to quote you all the documentation you can find. When the Union of South Africa was formed by the British, an act of the British Parliament in 1910, they were enacting the wishes of the white politicians of 2 colonies and 2 Boer republics as to how they would treat people who were not white to ensure sufficient labor for the mines and the farmers, commerce and industry, etc. And the answer was to have no political rights at all, no votes, and no trade union rights. To be in a trade union was okay, but to bargain collectively was illegal. And then eventually in 1913, the white parliament passed a law called the Natives Land Act, which left them with 7% of the land, the most inhospitable land for 2/3 of the population. Eventually increased to 13%, which meant that black people had to go to work to earn money to survive, because they didn't have land anymore. What happened over hundreds of years in Europe and England was done at the stroke of a pen. Why? Because black farmers were providing the crops to feed the mine workers, themselves without any assistance from government, were making it very difficult for white farmers to survive. So let's get rid of the competition. Let's create an industrial working class through giving them no rights to land. To reinforce it, black workers had to, for the first time, begin to pay taxes in cash, which means you have to go to work. What were those taxes? A hut tax, a wife tax, a dog tax, a car tax, taxes which no white paid. And you see how people are considered. Human taxes and dogs and cars are all the same if you want money, and people are forced to go to work. But they can't just go to work because they might flood into the town. So there were pass laws. Every black person over the age of 16, every man, had to carry a pass, and not to have it on him meant a criminal offense, and he would go to prison. And he was allowed to go to the town to seek a job if he had written permission to go. And if he couldn't find a job, he had to go home again. Well, people, of course, stayed because people needed to feed their families. And so 150,000 and sometimes 300,000 people a year went to prison because they wanted to feed their families. And white South Africans said, you see, these blacks, they have no sense of family. They leave them to go to work in the town. But the law said even if they find a job on a mine or on a farm, they may not take their families with them. Only the worker can go. I think you might agree it was a pretty immoral system. That was apartheid. The African National Congress was founded in 1912 to combat this upcoming Lands Act. And the resistance really was quite strong, and the attitude was that Africans throughout southern Africa, really throughout the British colonies all the way up to Tanganyika at the time, could be members. There was a sense of Africanness, of regaining the land and their rights. It took 100 years of conquest by the British, from 1905 to 1805 to 1906, to conquer the people and create this Union of South Africa in 1910. People resisted, always. But the resistance took the form of petitioning. It took the form of petitioning by educated Africans, translators, civil servants, minor civil servants. They would say, I'm quoting you, when we are civilized, the white man will give us our rights. But those who have oppressed you never find you civilized. They always move the goalposts, as they say. And so in the 1940s, during World War II, when President Roosevelt met with Prime Minister Churchill of Great Britain on a cruiser just off the Atlantic coast of the United States to declare the Atlantic Charter, the war aims in World War II against Nazi Germany, their aim was the end of colonialism and the equality of all people. And our young, educated African people took it seriously. They said, all people, then we want to be equal as well, and formed an African National Congress Youth League, which campaigned against the senior body to turn it into an activist organization with a mass movement. We're not going to stay unequal forever. Among the people involved, I mentioned Oliver Tambo earlier, but Nelson Mandela, a whole generation of people who took seriously the idea of the ending of colonial oppression and racial oppression. And there were passive resistance campaigns called Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign people would deliberately not have their passes on them. They would enter into black townships where they didn't have permission to go. Others would go into a post office where there are two doors, one for whites, one for blacks. There'd be a huge queue of blacks doing the work of whites, business work, and one or two whites with a separate counter, nobody to serve, virtually. So they'd go in and court arrest, and the idea was that they would bring the justice system to a standstill and compel the government to change. It was also an organizing mechanism for the African National Congress. When 8,000 people had gone to jail voluntarily for deliberately breaking the law, the government introduced a new law. To break a law, you would get the normal punishment. To break a law for the purpose of protesting against the law was a second crime. For the first crime, you might get 3 months. For the second crime, you could get 10 years. And when that didn't break this protest, they introduced lashing with a cane. I don't know if you've ever heard about it or read about it, but I've been in prison and I've heard it. I've also seen the frame on which people would be strapped, arms out, lying forward, bent over. And we would hear the screams. We would hear the lash and we would hear the screams. And the cane would be soaked in water to make it flexible. Its end was bound with twine in case it might split, and damage state property. And having struck with as much force as possible, the guard would then draw it across the back to actually cut the skin. I've seen the wheals. They remain forever. The scars remain forever. But the wounds heal. What doesn't heal is the scar in the mind. It did break that protest. And I heard people asking earlier about compromise. That's not compromise, that's survival. I have to say, I listened to the previous speakers, and I was fascinated by the difference of attitude between that of my comrades then and now and their attitudes. Their attitudes were about themselves and their need to take part for themselves and their satisfaction. And in the end, compromising, yes, you got to eat. Yes, you got to survive, but you continue because the system hasn't changed. It's a question of how much you can do at a given stage in your life. I worked with comrades and I was married and I had children. My wife was an activist. When she was pregnant and the children were young, she couldn't be out and about and risk being beaten and losing the child. But at other times she was equally as active as I was. You go through different phases of your life. And I'm fascinated I don't want to be ageist, but I'm fascinated to hear a person who's nowhere near 25 telling me what life is about. When I've been with people in prison for over 20 years, been with comrades who are nearby on death row, in a prison, the hanging prison, and hangings took place every week, of prisoners in general. Murder carried a prison sentence, rape carried a life death sentence, especially if a black person raped a white woman. You know that from your history as well. 150, 200 people a year were hanged, and we would hear them. We would hear the trapdoors being tested. We would hear the clanking of the chains as people were brought in to be hanged. We would hear prisoners begin to sing as the sheriff came along to tell them their time had come the next morning. They would start singing hymns and break off and start again and break off until there were 3,000 people singing together right through the night. And then the trapdoors would fall and the singing would stop as though an electric switch had been thrown. I was in that prison with some of my comrades for just less than 3 years. It made us ill. On the days when there were going to be hangings, we couldn't go into our exercise yard. We lived almost under the gallows. It's a dreadful experience, worse for the prisoners, of course. But what brutality. And there were prison guards. Prison guards in that prison were required to take a turn at the hangings. But there were some guards who chose to be there every week. They enjoyed the hangings. It's unbelievable what people can do. People with wives, with children, caring people, you would say. They even pat their dogs, you know. That's what we lived through. And yet, you see, it didn't break us. It didn't break my comrades. At the same time, we had some of our comrades who were sentenced to death, political comrades. And they would sing, 8 or 9 of them at a time on death row, would sing freedom songs. They would sing for 20 minutes just before lights out at 8 o'clock at night in the most beautiful harmonies. They would sing about their struggle, why they took part. They would sing a song, "Long live the ANC, long live. We shall never forget you." They knew what they were there for and what they were fighting for. And they taught 3,000 people to sing freedom songs with them until the whole place was jumping with these ideas. And I can tell you, I'm not a musician, not very musical, but I did teach myself to play the recorder and to eventually get a score. And I could play the freedom songs as well, and that's how we communicated. As you heard, I don't sing so good, but I could communicate with my recorder. And years, these guys their sentences were commuted eventually. And years later, I met one of them who rushed over. He'd heard that I was at a place where he was as well, to say that my playing to them gave them such hope and courage, that they weren't alone. Music is wonderful. It's such a communicator. But I do have to tell you, shortly after I was sentenced to life imprisonment, there were 4 of us together, whites. We were kept separately, racism in prison as well. And 3 of my comrades were going to the gallows and were singing freedom songs as they went, defiantly. And my 3 comrades who'd been there before me asked me not to sing with them because of the fear of punishment. And just having come through a trial where we escaped the death sentence, I don't know how, but we did, I listened to them. I didn't have the courage then to sing. And I can tell you that courage is a fluctuating thing. There are times when you can put your head up above the battlements and time when you keep your head down and regain your strength and go on with your struggle. And so to say, I cannot go on with the struggle because it makes me unhappy, that's out of my vocabulary, I'm afraid. And I want to cite to you, I don't know how many of you know the writing of Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist, Man's Search for Meaning, the book he wrote after 4 years, an Austrian psychiatrist, follower of Freud, who survived the Nazi concentration camps. And he wrote about his experience, and he summarized it more or less like this: that Freud thought that the sex drive was the main force in life. His disciple Adler thought it was the quest for power. And he, Frankl, came to the conclusion that the driving force was the search for meaning. And meaning was the meaning of life. And those who gave up had no sense of what they were in the prison for, gave up life very quickly and died very quickly. The conditions were like hell, bad food, diseases, but those who had a sense that they're going to survive, they're going to look after others, they're going to make a better world, they lasted longer, as did he, and then wrote this book and then subsequent books. I didn't know about this book until I was sentenced in 1963, came out in 1985. Around about 2006, I was given a copy of the book. 40 years after I thought life is wonderful. And I read this book, and what a nice feeling that this great philosophical intellectual had the same experience that I had. I felt it was good, I felt right. And he's right. And those who say life is about personal happiness and to hell with anybody else, I think got it wrong. I really do. I tried to say earlier in our little session over lunch, the very same students come to this university, is it a university, is it a college? University college, to study in the groves of academe. And how did they get here? They went through a school, through a public school system, through taxes, through people who were trained at other colleges, taught knowledge that's been built up over millennia. That's why we footnote our scientific papers, to show that we are following on a tradition. It's not, now it's become a question of priority and who's going to get paid for having this new insight. But it was Sir Isaac Newton, the inventor of the concept of gravity in the English-speaking world. The Germans say it was Leibniz, but they did it at the same time. Said, we stand on the shoulders of giants so that we may see further. And more recently, at a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, the president said, we stand on the shoulders of giants and they're sitting next to us here in the hall. Knowledge is a social phenomenon, it's not individual. Language is a social phenomenon. We express knowledge through our socially developed language. If we didn't have a common understanding of what's blue, what's black, what's up, what's down, what's sky, what's water, wind or air, you see how scientific I am, wind, water, etc., and fire and air, that's very basic science, you know, we couldn't be able to communicate with each other. So these students come here to a social institution and somehow get socialized into being individualists and forgetting that we are part of a whole. Interestingly, there's a nice contradiction in their behavior because they feel they have to be involved in changing society, but when it gets difficult, they drop out and say, I got to be happy. And I can't be happy when I drop out because my comrades are still in prison when I was released. And the people of my country are still poor. We haven't overcome a legacy of over 400 years of institutionalized racism. I just felt I had to gently say I disagree with my younger fellow strugglers for human justice. I'm going to stop there. I'd like, what's her face, Susan, to come and sit next to me. And I'd like you to ask whatever questions you like. And I want to assure you they can be, I've avoided a lot of the personal, although my life has, it illuminates where my ideas come from, what a struggle does to people. But ask questions, personal, historical, political, whatever you like. You have that democratic right. And I have the democratic right to decide if I'll answer them fully or not. Cheers.
Why were you released after 22 years?
Well, there comes a time when governments come to the conclusion that change is inevitable. And though the judge sentences you to life and not death, what he's doing is evading his responsibility, avoiding creating martyrs, and leaving it to the political government to decide when people should be released or whether they should die in prison, because life in South Africa legally means life. Well, by 1985, things were beginning to move, and this once mighty system was beginning to creak, developing a lot of pressure. The Cold War was coming to an end. You could see it happening. The need for the West to go on supporting apartheid as an ally was becoming less urgent. And also, they were looking for, the United States in particular, was looking for two things. One was to get Cuba out of Africa, and the other, Cuba is anathema for the United States, and played a tremendous role in liberating many countries in Africa, and was well entrenched in Angola and the biggest threat to South Africa, apartheid South Africa. So if they could negotiate a settlement which got the Cubans out and South Africa out of Angola, we could then have a change, and the Soviet Union was collapsing, so we weren't going to be under their tutelage. We would never have been, I assure you. But Cold War, that was the belief. And so the possibility of change was in the air, and my release was negotiated. I was the first of our 8 who were sentenced in the Rivonia trial to be released. A year and a half later, the eldest of us was released. Governor Mbeki had high blood pressure. So he was released on medical grounds. He had 23 and a half years. And then suddenly a whole bunch of 6 were released with life sentences. And finally, after 5 years, Nelson Mandela was released. So the only way I can explain it is that I was the trial balloon. If it punctured and went flat. And the oddity was that when I was released, the leadership of the ANC presented me to the world's media, but didn't say they had negotiated my release. But it was clear that they had, because there were lots of indications, and subsequently I was told categorically that they had approved it, what was happening. But they didn't say they had negotiated my release, and people would ask questions. And if they didn't say it, I couldn't say it, because you can do things quietly in diplomacy that you can't do publicly. People on your own side will say, why are you giving in? On the oppressor side, they say, we're not so weak, why don't we keep them there forever? You see. And I must say, it was a very tough time, and all I could do was just get on with the task of liberation. I came home, and after 22 years, and my wife rejoiced, until in my first year at home I was away for 6 months speaking and organizing, and she felt cheated. And she was asked to write her autobiography with a ghost writer, and she came up with the working title of He's Buggered Off Again. And so she never finished the book. She was very hurt by it, I must say, but I've added the personal just to tell you that it was such a wonderful feeling. I came out of prison. My daughter was on a kibbutz in Israel. Should I go to London on a South African Airways plane, which is South African territory in international law? The captain is in control. Would they have an agent on board to do me in? Or did I fly with the guy who'd done the negotiations on behalf of my daughter's kibbutz? Indirectly, there were links. Should I fly on an El Al plane and go directly to Israel? And on the plane, I got a headache very quickly. And I needed headache tablets. So I asked the stewardess, See how old-fashioned I am. Cabinet attendant of the female variety. For some headache tablets, and she gave me some. They were sort of crushed up aspirin in this little pink paper. And so I asked her for some water. And you know, they rush up and down, settling passengers. And when she came past, "Can I have some water?" She said, "Come," and took me to the galley. And on the way, I suppose she was doing her duty, she said, "Why have you got a headache?" I have to tell you, Israelis, when they speak English, it's a hostile language. It's very guttural. So I said, "I don't know, I've just got a headache, you know. A headache's a headache." "Yes, but why?" I said, "Well, maybe it's the cognac I've had. I haven't had one for a long time." "Oh. But why is that?" "Well, it's the noise. I can't stand the noise of all these people." "Why, where have you been?" "Oh, damn, I've been in prison." And as she gives me the glass of water, she says, "How long were you in prison for?" And I said, 22 years. She froze. She froze. I could see her thinking, 22 years, rape and murder. She turned her back, she picked up a little black-handled kitchen knife, started slicing lemons. Really, I could see what was happening, and after a time, I think she must have realized that if it was rape and murder, I would have found any excuse for a headache but that, you know. And so she turned around with a knife in her hand and said, "Well, what were you in for?" And I said, "Conspiracy to overthrow the apartheid government." And she threw down the lemon, threw down the knife, and said, "Welcome aboard our aircraft." I must tell you, it was a very moving experience. We then sat and talked for 6 hours. And for the first time in 22 years, I sat talking to a woman, a person of the female persuasion, without a guard present. No, it was, and I learnt about her children, about her life, about her husband. And when I told my wife about it, she was extremely jealous about it. My goodness me, women. I told you, I know about gender equality, but in interpersonal relationships, that's more difficult. Next question, please. The back.
I came of age in the time of the anti-war, the anti-Vietnam demonstrations in this country. It was actually pretty easy to be against the war. You could do it with relatively few risks. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the very different example that your life embodies, that there were risks, there were consequences. What motivated you to risk the privileges of being a white South African, to risk your life, your family, everything for the struggle? If you could talk a little bit about that, I'd really appreciate it.
I can't talk a little bit about it because it's fairly complex. I'm born in 1933. My parents were of the left. My dad a trade union organizer. My mother went to socialist Sunday school in the East End of London. My parents were communists. They supported the Spanish loyalist government, which was overthrown by the Franco-fascists, supported by the United States and Britain and France, as well as Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And so I was a clever little boy and reading newspaper headlines by the age of 5 and 6, sitting on my father's lap. I couldn't have told you about Kristallnacht, and I couldn't have told you the fancy words, but I knew there was racism in the Nazi period. I knew people were being murdered. And I knew that eventually South Africa in 1939, after the declaration of war, sent white soldiers to fight against the racist Nazis while we had racism at home. And this was incongruous for me. I didn't know the word incongruous when I was 10 years old. But it didn't fit. When you're 10 years old, it's black or white, if you'll forgive the word play. Come home from school. Why does my school book say that we are a democracy, and a democracy means all grown-ups can vote for their representatives in Parliament, and even sit in Parliament if they're elected? and every 5 years there's an election and the majority party takes over or remains in office. And I say, but only whites can vote. It's not every grown-up. So why do they say every grown-up? And because my parents, let me shock you, because they were of the left, they told me the truth. It's only when you get into power you have to spin a little bit, you know. It doesn't matter which party you belong to. And so I realized that there's injustice in the world. And I was taught to respect people, whoever they were. They would come to our home, workers in their rough boots and clothes, and professors and medical doctors of all races. And if I eyed the last little potato greedily, it would be given to somebody else deliberately. So I would learn to respect the visitor. I was fortunate that I never went hungry because there was always bread and gravy if there was nothing else. And somehow in the hungry 30s, my mother magically had something more in the pot for any visitor who came. During World War II, my heroes were the people who fought behind the lines for freedom. They risked their lives, the French Marquis, the young people in Russia, the people of Hungary and Germany and so on, and Italy, the partisans, partigiani, and so on. And Nelson Mandela, you see, one doesn't ask of Nelson Mandela, why did you take part? You ask me because I'm white. Nelson Mandela says he grew up listening to the oral tradition of the heroes who fought the British imperialists for 100 years until the conquest occurred, and he wished to emulate them, to serve his people. Well, I had the same feelings. And you see how I understand the question, because this is how we grow up. The history is written by people who are white. And to be white and have the privilege is normal. If you act against it, you're an enemy, you're a traitor to your people. I was treated that way, by the way. It's not very pleasant to be in a minority of one in just about every school class and at university. But I was something of an athlete, not a good one, but I was an athlete and I could kick hell out of a ball with the best of them. And so the guys tolerated me. But there's a need to stand by principle. If you believe in justice, you soon learn that justice is indivisible. Later you get more sophisticated and you read about Pastor Niemöller in Germany, in Nazi Germany, who says when they came for the communists, he kept quiet. When they came for the socialists, he said nothing. When they came for the trade unionists, he said nothing, and the professors and the teachers, and when they came for him, there was nobody to speak out. Well, I learned that quite early in life, without having to live through the whole Nazi period before discovering it. And that's why I got involved, because I didn't feel I wanted to lie about my existence, to lie to myself about why I could go to school when half the kids in the country never went to school because there were no schools for them. And those who did go had 10 times less spent on them by the government than for white kids. And I was a first-generation South African, not an indigenous South African. It was just utterly wrong. And if you believe in equality and justice, then you must act. And that's what I discovered Viktor Frankl discovered when he was in a Nazi concentration camp. I had to learn it for myself. But I also had rather clever parents who had very little formal education, but were fantastically well-read autodidacts. What a lovely word. And I would ask questions, and my mother in particular would give me explanations of social phenomena and political things and war that always took me beyond my understanding. And when I'd say, yes, but why? She'd say, well, go away and think of it. And when you've thought about it, then come and talk to me again. So I had to think it through. I wasn't spoon-fed it. And she required of me more than that, integrity. And I suppose I required my mother's love, so I learnt these lessons. It's a great combination. I feel quite lucky, actually, in the sense that I've had tremendous companionship and comradeship. I've tried hard and sometimes failed to live up to the values I believe in. And it's been worth it, and in the end my country's free. They're huge problems, but we're free to solve them. I'm sorry you asked why, and I'm telling you what the consequence was, but it's a kind of, sometimes a smug self-satisfaction, which is a weakness, I have to confess. But it is a nice feeling. It is a nice feeling. And that, as Susan said, there's 3 of us, of our group, left alive. As they all die, so I become more important.
Take one more question. Is there?
I want a few minutes before they go.
Okay. Oh, okay. You can have the final few minutes,
Yeah.
and then I don't know whether there's still time to mingle outside with tea and cookies, but take a few more minutes.
I want to tell you that I am involved politically. I am still a member of the African National Congress. We have tremendous problems, and I've been appointed to what's called an integrity commission to call on members to uphold the trust that has been placed in them. There's corruption, there are people who don't do the jobs they're paid for, and so on. Very difficult position to be in. I've taken leave of absence, one to travel the world before I have a hip operation, and it gets me out of the difficulties that we face on that commission. You see, I do sneak away sometimes for my happiness. And but I am deeply involved in social projects. One of them is a music project, and I have some little brochures here which I'd love you to take. In my home suburb of Cape Town, surrounded by mountains and the sea, probably 60,000 people, of whom roughly 40,000 are black Africans and about 10,000 people called coloured, the fishing folk, who were moved out of the village, and now there's a rich valley of whites, and I live in that suburb, and we're still spatially divided. And a young woman, white, trained jazz musician from the University College of Music, set up a project with a concept that music is a universal language, and through this Kronendal Music Academy of Hout Bay, which is the suburb, she can bring young people together through music. And I must tell you that I'm a patron of the project. My experience of music during prison and the role of freedom songs in our struggle made me understand that music can play a very important role. And these young kids with 15 teachers, including voice teachers and 13 different instruments, with instruments mainly I've collected, but not only me, hundreds of instruments, 160 people involved in the project. Over 25 draw a partial living out of it, out of a very poor community. It's a superb project, and it's very fulfilling. And when I see the kids playing and singing and playing music together, it's weepy time for me, I must tell you. At the last New Year's or Christmas concert, there was a 15-year-old kid, white, individually trained, accompanying 3 little girls on the beginnings of a chamber orchestra, a quarter-sized cello and a half-sized violin and a 3/4-sized viola, and they were playing for the first time in public. And they lost it a little bit. They started off very promisingly, and then somehow they lost the beat. And this 15-year-old did something absolutely remarkable. She could have gone on and played with a flourish and been the virtuoso. She didn't. She looked round at them. She slowed her tempo. She encouraged them back into unison on the beat, and then picked up the beat and brought them back into it. Music is a social project. It's not just about the individual. That's that project. I can talk about other projects, but I wanted to tell you about that. And to find people who are committed to this in a small community where we defy the history to overcome it. That's much more political than younger people can give out the leaflets and shout at the hustings about vote for us and down with the opponents. I can't do that anymore. The problems are so immense. Doesn't matter who's in the city council, whichever part of the country, the problems are going to take generations to overcome. That's what we're left with. But we can make it possible for young people to overcome the past. That's what we do. Thanks for listening to me.